Great. So thanks for coming today, everybody. We're about to kick off our second panel, which is the environmental panel, focusing on the, quote, wickedness of the food, energy, water nexus. And just as an FYI, we're going to use that as kind of the jumping off point to discuss wicked problems in the environment in general. My name is James Hacker. I'm a current MPA student here at Maxwell, as well as the editor-in-chief of Sense and Sustainability. And before we kick things off, I just want to thank the various people who were involved in this. So first, our lovely conference team. So Jack, Emily, Amy, Ari, Alex, and all that crew. Second, the members of STEP, Students for Mars Environmental Policy. Mark Nicholas, who's sitting here in front, as well as our fearless leader, Megan O'Connor, who unfortunately could not be here. Alex Hackbarth, and Elisa Hitt, who I think is here as well. So there she is. Great, so why don't we go ahead and just kick things off. Just by way of introduction, first sitting closest to me is Professor Paul Hirsch. Paul is an assistant professor at SUNY ESF, as well as a research associate at the Maxwell Center for Environmental Policy and Administration, as well as a research associate at the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration at PARC. Paul's research focuses on the challenges of managing complex environmental problems, particularly in the interplay of technology, politics, and science. Paul got his BS from Cornell, his MS from the University of Georgia, and his PhD from Georgia Tech. Sitting next to Paul is a man who should need no introduction for most of you, Peter Wilcoxon, who has been spoken of already today. He's an associate professor of economics and public administration here, where he teaches most of the core economics courses. He's also the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Administration, as well as the co-director of the Brookings Climate and Energy Economics Project. His principal areas of research are clean energy technology and the electrical grid. He received his BA from the University of Colorado and his PhD from Harvard. Next to Pete is Matt Millay, who many of you already know. Matt is the Deputy County Executive here at Onondaga County for Physical Services. He's committed to serving state and local government to promote sustainable solutions to our nation's infrastructure and environmental problems. Prior to working for Onondaga County, he was at the New York State Facilities Corporation, as well as the New York State Governor's Office and the Department of Environmental Conservation. So thanks for our panelists. And to kick things off, I'll have Paul Hirsch set the stage for us.
Thank you, James, and I'm really happy to be here. And in fact, I want to start my remarks with sharing my enthusiasm for the idea of wicked problems and for the fact that we are having conferences about wicked problems and that the nature of the issues that we're dealing with today are being acknowledged in their full wickedness, in their full complexity, and that efforts are being made to grapple with that complexity, with that wickedness, rather than moving past the complex aspects sort of onto the more tame aspects that we're perhaps more comfortable from dealing with within our training and organizational structures. But in expressing my enthusiasm, by no means do I want to trivialize the serious nature of these issues. So if we're talking about the food, energy, water nexus, as we've been asked to look at here today, what we're really talking about is survival, right? Food, energy, and water are exactly what are required for survival and for human thriving. And unless we look at them in relationship to each other as a system, we're going to miss some of the key issues, and not only that, we're going to make decisions within one domain which perhaps have negative impacts on another domain, therefore threatening survival and human flourishing. But even as I recognize the gravity of these issues, I still remain enthusiastic because there is something in the acknowledgement of wickedness that goes beyond just talking about the way the world and its problems are, but it in fact engages something in us that perhaps otherwise would be hibernating, would not be fully called forth. And you know, in my own training, my own experience, my own ideas of who I wanted to become and how I thought about my education and what I want to do, in fact, the acknowledgement of wickedness really, I think, more than anything else, and we can argue about the term, but the spirit of what it's getting at, it really calls forth that, and it really speaks to what I think my training was about and what I think I want to do in terms of engaging with wickedness. And I hazard to guess that many of you here today have the same sense, that as people that perhaps have gone through different disciplinary perspectives, as people who are somewhere in the middle of the worlds of academia, nonprofit, public service, and leadership, something in there as we kind of train ourselves and practice and engage in all these dimensions, as we move across these different places, it's in fact grappling with wickedness is what's called for in these movements. So what I'm going to discuss today is, first I'm going to discuss what makes a problem wicked. I'm going to draw on some of the key sort of writers in the field, and I'm not going to go super in depth into that, but I want to touch on sort of the characteristics of wicked problems. And then I want to use that as a jumpstart to explain a little bit more deeply why I'm really enthusiastic, intellectually, sort of from a standpoint of engagement, why I'm enthusiastic about wicked problems. And then I want to provide an example of a wicked problem that takes place in the food, energy, water nexus. And then I want to speak to some of my own research and how we might think or engage more with this kind of problem. So first, what makes a problem wicked? So the original sort of classic paper that people cite when they talk about wicked problems is a paper by Horst Rattel and Melvin Weber, published in 1973 in Policy Sciences, called Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning. And in that paper, they lay out 10 characteristics of wicked problems. And I'm just going to read them briefly. There is no definitive formulation of a wicked problem. Wicked problems have no stopping rule. We don't know when it's solved. Solutions to wicked problems are not true or false, but good or bad. There is no immediate and no ultimate test of a solution to a wicked problem. Every solution to a wicked problem is a one-shot operation because there is no opportunity to learn by trial and error. Every attempt counts significantly. Wicked problems do not have an innumerable set of potential solutions, nor is there a well-described set of permissible operations that may be incorporated into the plan. Every wicked problem is essentially unique. Every wicked problem can be considered to be a symptom of another problem. The existence of a discrepancy representing a wicked problem can be explained in numerous ways, and the choice of explanation determines the nature of the problem's resolution. And finally, the planner has no right to be wrong. So we see here some planners, because that's what they were, trying to define the nature of the problems that they were dealing with back in 1973, and trying to say that there's a different kind of thinking that is needed to deal with these kind of problems. Another writer that I've drawn on a lot is my PhD advisor, whose name is Brian Norton. And I'm just going to read you a couple quotes from a paper he has called Ways of Wickedness, Analyzing Wicked Problems Using Messy Tools is the name of the paper. He says that no descriptive disciplinary perspective or expert system can embody all of the variables and data necessary to understand, predict, and control the functioning of the dynamic systems within which humans struggle with complex problems and conflicts. He says that the formal analytic methods that are created as aids in decision-making can be applied to real problems only after many difficult and contentious steps have already been taken. And these steps have each simplified the original reason for distress. So what we're saying here, if we're thinking about what makes a problem wicked, I look to number 1 and number 9 of Rattel and Weber. Number 1 being no definitive formulation, and number 9 being you can explain it in numerous ways, and what you do depends on how you solve it. And I look at that as a problem of problem framing, really. That wicked problems can imagine this whole field of background, even food, energy, water, nexus. As powerful as it is, as calling forth some of the major variables we need to contend with and in relation to each other, of course it's not the whole system, is it? We could talk about food, energy, water, biodiversity, poverty, technology. We could add all of these and many more things into that nexus, right? We could expand the view. So wicked problems, really the central feature of a wicked problem is that we have this mess of a whole bunch of variables and dynamics interpreted in different ways that we somehow need to put some frame around so that we can grapple with it in a professional sense. But the frame that we choose is a function of our own perspective, our own ways of thinking, our own values and interests, and there's no definitive way to say what the right frame is, and different people from different perspectives and different people from different disciplines will put a different frame around the problem. So in fact, there's multiple problems dealing with. And there's no algorithmic way or no technical way or no way of expertise to reconcile any of that. That's the wickedness. Then what we do is sort of jump over that and then get into our silos, and then we have nice, neat problems. But to really engage in that wickedness is a profound thing, I think, and it involves recognizing in some sense the contingency of problem formulation and our own perspective in relationship to the way that happens. And furthermore, the fact that the ability to frame a problem is not just kind of an intellectual act. It's not just a cognitive organizational act. It's a political act. Because when I say what elements of a problem to focus on, I've also said what elements of the problem we're not going to focus on. And perhaps the elements that we focused on are things that, perhaps privilege some perspectives over others, or perhaps privilege some ways of organizing and thinking over others. So any time, particularly in the nature of wickedness, that I organize the thinking around a problem, I'm not just using my brain, I'm doing something political. And that really makes things wicked, I think. And of course, it gets more complicated when you have all these disciplines coming in with so many different ways kind of intervening there, right? Disciplines saying, putting out whether it's cost-benefit analysis as a way to organize complexity, whether it's ideas about hegemony and agency that might come from anthropology. Whatever the discipline is, it's going to impose or offer some perspective, some way of organizing that complexity, which is incredibly powerful and necessary, but in and of itself is a choice that we make that has no fundamental basis given, not that it has no fundamental basis, but that it is a choice that we make that highlights some dimensions and puts others in the periphery. And there's no way to get around that. We can never find a universal kind of view on wicked problems. We can never create a holistic model. That is, as Norton says, that is the nature. For any complex public environmental controversy of importance to diverse interests, it will not be possible to model that conflict in such a way as to explain all the relevant phenomena or to provide an algorithmic solution to it. So I think that's, that gives us a sense of what we're dealing with in terms of wicked problems. Now, why is that exciting? I mean, it could be paralyzing, right? It could be like, okay, there's nothing we can do. We're sort of, we have a problem from the jump, from the outset, because any frame that I have, any training that I have, any organizational perspective I have is fundamentally contingent and from a perspective. So, this could be a cause for powerlessness, but I don't think it is. As I said in the beginning, I think what makes it exciting is because it requires the ability to some extent move across disciplines, to be able to recognize which disciplinary models and perspectives are useful in different contexts, and also to be able to move across the boundaries of research and practice. And I'm hazard a guess again to say that anybody in this program has already decided that that's what they want to do. So in fact, the articulation that something is a wicked problem is for people like us, like an invitation to get involved and to really get our hands dirty in that nature of the wickedness, not just to assume that away and get in the pretty part later. It also, speaking personally, and perhaps maybe for some of you, I actually think it's quite philosophically interesting to have to negotiate this tension of the fact that, especially when it comes to the environment, we do live in one world. There is one fundamental planet that we share. And yet, because of this multi-perspectivity, we also live in a completely fractured world that is interpreted in multiple ways, and those multiple ways do not fit together into a coherent picture or a coherent puzzle. So there's this simultaneous, and they're both realities, that one world is a reality, is true, and that there is a fractured world when we take the social perspectives into account is also true. And we somehow need to negotiate between those. And I find that an incredibly intriguing set of questions intellectually, but then also personally and practically. So if we think about that kind of field, that messy field that we need to impose a frame on, getting back to the food, energy, water nexus, I'll say again, I think that's a very powerful frame and a very powerful way to focus in on some of the key dimensions that matter to us when it comes to the relationship between the environment and between society. And it represents, we have to recognize that it's sort of an art. This is another reason it's sort of exciting to be that. To choose the right frame, I've sort of said it can't be a science. So in a sense, it has to be a little bit more of an art. And I think whoever came up with the food, energy, water nexus, there's a certain artistic brilliance in it because it's a nice balance between expanding the plane to infinity and contracting it where we're just focusing on certain variables to the expense of others. So we have to be able to do that. We have to be able to find that right balance between looking at enough phenomena but not too much. So let's talk now about the food, energy, water nexus. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from an article from Forbes magazine. In 2012, farmers in Kern County grew almost $1.5 billion in grapes and nearly $1 billion in almonds. Milk, citrus, and pistachios were also top commodities for the region, helping to bring the overall value of agriculture to more than $6 billion for the county. Such large-scale agriculture takes an enormous amount of water, a resource which today is in short supply in Kern. Groundwater sources are running low. Extraction from wells in Kern accounts for almost 40% of California's entire groundwater use. A recent decree by the governor also cut Kern off from receiving additional water supplies. In the last few years, a new player is also fighting for water in the county. Hydraulic fracturing is now a top industry in Kern County. While the region has been home to some of the county's top producing oil fields for years, now an additional 1,388 fracture wells dot the county's landscape, using an estimated 164,000 gallons of water per well. Kern is just one of many locations facing this quandary. Nearly half of all fracking in the nation takes place on high or extremely water-stressed areas of the U.S. 55% of wells are in places that are currently experiencing drought, and yet more than 15 billion barrels of oil currently sit under Kern County, enough to replace all of California's foreign imports for 43 years at current consumption rates. The article ends, so how do we weigh the needs of agriculture, energy production, and water use? And so it's with enthusiasm, with this kind of question, that I want to come back to. And I want to just conclude by saying, and here drawing on my own research, I think three domains, and actually it's my own nexus, and I'm going to call it the Public Discourse Policy Analysis Leadership Nexus. So I want us to think about, superimposed on the Food, Energy, Water Nexus, the Public Discourse Policy Analysis Leadership Nexus, as the place that we can find this additional dimension that we need to bring to wicked problem solving, and ask, how does this dimension play out in these three areas? So briefly, do I have about 5 minutes, James, or am I? Great. So briefly, in the realm of public discourse, what do we have to do to help there be a public discourse that can actually engage wicked problems? Some of us will be in position where we can foster this. Well, as Norton says, what makes wicked problems unique is that they occur at the intersection of multiple values. And if that is true, then what is required in public discourse, and I think this is in some sense the hardest thing, but perhaps I would say it's one of the most important things, is some way to move past the polarization of perspectives that we see today. And again, I think wicked problems, perhaps not in that particular formulation, but the spirit there is an opening to do that, right? Because if we're saying that there's multiple values at play, that those values are interpreted from different perspectives, and that they're legitimate values, what we're really saying is that the polarized view that we have, that we often kind of manifest in public debate, is really completely inadequate. So what we need to do is find ways to infuse into the public recognition of trade-offs, appreciation of uncertainty and what it means and what it doesn't mean. We need to infuse a certain sobriety that every solution that we take, including doing nothing, entails some sort of risk and some gains and losses. And I know this sounds easier said than done, but you think about hydraulic fracturing in California or in New York State, and you recognize, that story that was told was not from the perspective of there's good and there's bad. It was that there's multiple things going on. There's profound energy resources, which obviously can have economic benefits, energy security benefits, and perhaps even climate change benefits if those energy resources produce less carbon emission in the way that they're tapped into. But of course, at the same time, there may be threats to water supplies that we need to look carefully at that, whether it's quantity issues out west or whether it's quality issues here. And at the same time, that has links to the food system, whether it's the large-scale agriculture in California or whether it's farmers here in New York State who may look to hydraulic fracturing as a way to actually make continuing farming viable because it provides them an alternative source of revenue to keep farms going. I'm not trying to lay out all the connections, but to show that we need to allow in the discourse a recognition. We need to invoke or inspire a public discourse that includes these dimensions. Bringing closer to home, what does it mean for policy analysis to recognize wicked problems? It means that we have to take a skeptical attitude towards attempts at complete and holistic explanations of complex phenomena. It means that those of us who are experts in one field or training to be experts have to have a willingness to appreciate that we are applying an analytical lens to the phenomena we study, one of several, and that choices are made in doing that, and that our analytical lens highlights certain things and not others. And ultimately, we have to find ways to think integratively with people who bring other perspectives to bear. Not an easy thing sometimes for people who are highly trained in specific perspectives. And finally, from our own, as policy analysts or thinkers in that realm, we need to add perhaps a dose of humility when we recognize that our analytical lenses are not just, as I said, intellectual tools, but something that we do within a landscape of inequality. And when we are the ones who say what the components of a problem are, that may have political implications and implications within that landscape of inequality, which I think should give us some pause and humility. Again, not too much pause, not draw us back, not give us powerlessness, but just have us try to get as an expanded perspective as we can on a problem. And finally, when it comes to leadership, to turn to the, and I'm not being critical of Governor Cuomo by any means. I'm just pointing out, I've heard him say, seen him quoted, once we figure out the science, then we'll decide what to do about hydraulic fracturing. And in a sense, that's an opening for me to say what I think is called for in leadership when it comes to wicked probleming is actually a recognition that the science will not provide a definitive answer, no matter how much science is done. And leadership involves making decisions, and that decisions will involve gains, will involve losses, will involve uncertainties, and requires the ability to make to embrace that multi-perspectivity, that uncertainty, the fact that different people want and see different things, and nonetheless make a decision and be responsible for it and accountable for it, and then adaptive in the face of what unfolds. And so I guess I'll just complete by saying that I think each of us here will probably move in between each of these domains. We all have conversations with other people, and we can look for ways to expand the realm of people that we talk to and the range of values that we appreciate. We can look for ways as policy analysts to apply our lens powerfully, but also in collaboration and respect for the alternative perspectives and lenses. And we can look for ways when we're in leadership positions or when we're supporting those in leadership to recognize that leadership and policy analysis, that there's a gap there. Policy analysis can provide an expanded perspective, can provide ideas about the implications, but ultimately cannot provide the definitive justification for a leadership decision, which must be made as a leadership choice. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Professor Hirsch. So just to kick off the panel discussion, I want to sort of work our way down the line and start with this idea of the discourse analysis leadership nexus. So when you're discussing these issues with policymakers, how do you induce them to conceptualize wicked problems in general and then specific to environmental issues?
I mean, the idea that I've been working with is, so I think one, what you're getting at is the need for a language to talk about wicked problems. And it can't be a specialized, disciplinary, jargony language. And in fact, the only place that that language can exist is kind of ordinary language that real people use. That's ultimately the language that we have to use to develop a way to engage wicked problems. That language might involve metaphors and all kinds of things that we do in ordinary language. So what I've tried to do, I've tried to talk about trade-offs. I've played with the concept of trade-offs a lot, and I don't think it's perfect, but I've tried to see ways that the concept of trade-offs can be infused into political discussions, because trade-offs basically means that there's gains and losses. And so if you have the opportunity to communicate to someone in a decision-making framework, I think the idea, that's one word that can, it's less, in fact, it's more powerful than wicked in some sense, because trade-offs puts a point on the fact that there's hard choices to be made. But it still recognizes that there's gains and losses. Sometimes I use the term complex trade-offs to show that those gains and losses get interpreted in different ways. But that's one thing that I would say. The other thing I just want to acknowledge, though, is, of course, if you look at Obama before, he talked about biofuels. I found a video of Obama talking about biofuels before he was elected president. And he was talking about the costs and benefits of biofuels, and there's some good things, some bad things. He was appreciating the complexity. And then you see one of his State of the Union addresses, and he talks about how great biofuels are with no recognition of any of the negative impacts. So I recognize that from a political standpoint, talking about trade-offs and wickedness is very challenging. And I'm not naive about that, which is why I think that those three changes in public discourse, leadership, and policy analysis almost have to kind of move forward together as a sort of state change. One can't move by itself.
Great. And moving on to the second point of that, the policy analysis side of things, I want to turn to Professor Wilcox. And how do you work through the idea of wicked problems as a policy analyst, and how do you communicate these issues both to the broader public and to those in a position to make decisions?
Okay, well, so is this working? Yeah. Okay. So I guess I want to start by following up on your question to Paul, which is just to point out that when you're dealing with people in the policy world, nobody ever starts out thinking, I am dealing with a wicked problem. Instead, they think about, I am dealing with an energy problem, because whatever their agency is or whatever their responsibility is, conditions almost automatically how they think about the problem. So the very first thing that's important is to get people to realize that there are all these other multiple facets to the problem. So, for example, the area that I work in a lot is climate change. And something that Dave said, quoting Tina, so this is Pete quoting Dave, quoting Tina, so take it with a grain of salt, is that democracy trumps time. And one of the worst things that has happened in the climate world is that in the early days of international concern about climate change, time trumped democracy. So in the very early days, long before the Kyoto Protocol, just after the 1992 UN Framework Convention, there was a big call for the scientific consensus on what should be done about climate change. And a bunch of physical scientists basically shouldered that burden and said, what we need to do is immediately have quantitative, verifiable emissions limits for the entire world of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Now, in that formulation, that's a science formulation. From a scientific perspective, that was great. There was zero social science, anthropology, economics, political science, nothing in there about whether this could be done, whether it would impact people differentially depending on their income level or anything. And it set the world, so I'm going to stop ranting in a minute, but it basically, this occurred in about 1994, okay? So 20 years of almost complete inaction in climate change resulted from poor framing of a truly wicked problem by people who just thought their side of the problem was all there was, right? And they thought that just quantitative limits from a scientific point of view would solve the problem. So the stakes are really high. People do not perceive in their disciplinary silos that they're dealing with a wicked problem. And so an exciting thing about this meeting, right, is that you guys will go out in your careers and not start out that way, and you'll talk to other people, right, and you'll spread the word that there has to be a broader way of thinking about things. Now, I think to answer the question that James actually asked me, the thing that I found most useful, so I work on climate policy, and the people who will have the most to do about climate policy in developed countries are electric utilities. And so I talk to people from electric utilities, sometimes people who are managers who work there or people who are from lobby groups. And the most important thing to having a good conversation with those people is to be open to exactly the kinds of things Paul was talking about, right? To the fact that they have different values, they have different needs. And if you come into a room and you say, I want to hear what your problems are and see, you know, where there's room for us to make progress, you have a much better conversation. Now, everybody in this room, because you're in this room early in the morning, is already thinking, well, of course, that, you know, how would anybody approach a problem differently? But I have been in conferences like this, on panels where the discussion has been, what should we do about climate change? And I've had colleagues not from this department who come in and say, look, there is one way, this is the answer, it needs to be done now, and if you don't understand that, then you don't understand science, right? Or there's something wrong with your view of the world. And that just cuts off debate. It just cuts off the conversation and alienates people. So I know I'm speaking to the converted, but stick with your convictions, be open to hearing other people's problems, and it helps a lot.
Hello? Okay. So now I want to turn to Matt, because as you're in more of the leadership, decision-making position. So how do you view the gap between discourse analysis and leadership? How does it impact your work, and how do you see that gap closing?
I think the gap, you're absolutely right, there is a gap, because I think in government and when you're all out there practicing, the problems present themselves in their own ways. You're not looking to solve the problem presents itself to you, so there's not necessarily a lot of analysis on the front end. It's simply, it is what it is in front of you, and you use the tools that you have to address it in however you dictate it. And a lot of times, you don't wish to deal with the problem, and I think we have a great example of a micro wicked problem in Onondaga County with our lake. And it wasn't necessarily something that anybody wanted to do anything about until we were sued and forced to respond to a federal judge saying you must clean it up. And the same holds true for Allied Chemical, where they had to deal with it, but they weren't going to until someone made them. So I think at the policy level, it becomes, it's incumbent upon the systems in place that force us to address these things which we may not wish to address. And I don't think Onondaga County wished to address the pollution that they were causing in Onondaga Lake until someone sued them and made them do it. Then you have to deal with the dilemmas that Paul spoke of, okay, now that we're being forced to deal with it, what do we do? And how do we do it? And that's where I think you're absolutely right. The complex trade-offs really come in. And again, Onondaga Lake's a great example of complex trade-offs. It's not going to be restored. The standard that the science would dictate and that some potential science panel would dictate is your goal is to restore that lake to the condition it was in before it was polluted. And then the discussion turns into a trade-off discussion of how close can you get to that, at what cost will you impose that burden upon taxpayers to get there. And the hard part about cleaning something up is you can get it 95% towards that pre-release condition for X amount of dollars, and you can get it 96% closer to that condition to X times 4, or X times 5, or X times 6. So then the complexity really brings itself to the fore when you're getting closer to the end. And I think it's a great example locally that's worth looking into on the notion of wicked problems, the different players, the fact that we have a private cleanup going on through a federal Superfund program and a public cleanup going on through the rubric of the Clean Water Act. And I think that you're absolutely right that it wasn't addressed globally by any leader saying, I want to take this on, bring all of these disparate groups together, and we'll come up with a solution. Each solution kind of is appearing in and of itself through its own evolution.
So taking a step or a brief step back, where do wicked problems come from? So food, energy, and water have all been issues for a long time, and now all of a sudden people are talking about the food, energy, water nexus. So what leads something to, become a wicked problem or to not? Any of you can take that.
Well, so I'll jump in. I'll say one of the things is just simply scale. So a colleague that I knew a number of years ago said that basically anything that people do, no matter how benign or helpful it seems, becomes problematic when a lot of people do it in the same area. And so that certainly is true with renewable energy in the areas that I work in, or water. And so that one of the things is just simply scale, concentrating a lot of people in an area.
Well, the only thing so it's also a kind of a problem framing act. I mean, someone came up with the phrase, and I in fact Googled food, energy, water nexus, and it only goes back to about middle of 2013. I mean, nobody said that before 2013. I mean, you can see the charts, and then it kind of spikes at a couple places, and there's a couple UN agencies and a couple reports about the food, energy, water nexus, and it connects back to the Millennium Development Goals. So I would completely agree that there's something about the nature of the problems themselves, and there's something about the nature of people who are in a position to frame the problems, that they've tapped into a particular way of doing that speaks to people, that speaks to the range of institutions and organizations that are prepared to get involved in this. And so that's, again, it's the power of problem framing, right? Who came up with the term adaptation and mitigation? I mean, these are conceptual ways that we frame problems that then frame everything that we think about for those problems. But these are social constructions, right? These are people, I'm not saying they're not real, but somebody came up with these ideas and imposed them on it, which I think is a fascinating thing to think about. And it's kind of empowering as well, because people like us came up with, did that.
I think, and I appreciate being invited to speak on this panel. When I got the invitation, it said Food, Water, Energy Nexus. It was kind of an aha moment, and it's stuff that I've been exposed to and worked on. So I think in a practical level, where do you see it? Where can you touch it and feel it is, in my experience, one of the first places that I encountered it was a discussion about Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant in Westchester County. And was the state of New York going to continue to allow it to withdraw water from the Hudson River to cool it or not? And that's the nexus right there for water and energy. And the point being that we need this energy at a bottleneck in this utility system where it's absolutely integral to the metropolitan economy of 3 states that Indian Point provides, I think, 2 or 3 megawatts of electricity. But it's also doing incredible environmental harm by taking billions of gallons of water out of the Hudson River, returning it at a high temperature, killing millions of fish, and the discussion was, were we going to continue to allow them to do that or not? And the answer was we were not going to. So for 50 years they were allowed to, and then the solution was no, you will not anymore. And if they're going to continue to operate that facility, they have to put in dry cooling at a cost of several $billion, which will have a rate impact. And I think the food connection in New York State in particular is that with the efficiencies in factory farming in the Midwest and elsewhere, New York State farms are no longer competitive. They're, and I think we're seeing a return to local farming with a resurgence of buy local and organic and transportation costs being a little bit higher. But we've lost a tremendous amount of our agricultural economy in New York State. And this has come up through an agricultural council that we put together at the county. And we've had a great professor, Potiker from ESF, come in and talk with us about food security issues. And I'll tell you what, from a public policy perspective and a leadership perspective, there's not a lot of government officials in New York State that are talking about food security. And that's something where I think academia just plays a key role of saying, hey, everybody, you're not seeing this coming yet, but things go bad in California, the drought continues, big issues are on the horizon. If we have plenty of water, we've got plenty of electricity, but there's no farmers, we could have some serious issues. So that's just some examples of what I'm seeing.
Just to kind of build on that, and Paul can accuse me of having one frame at which I look at the world, but one other reason why this might have bubbled up is the relationship between energy use in one part of the world and food and water supplies in other parts of the world. So a big unfortunate consequence of U.S. energy use is damage to food and water supplies in developing countries. So that there's a nexus there that I think has become more and more acute over the last few years.
Actually, Pete, I see you as the epitome of somebody who has a great ability to apply your disciplinary framework, but also a great ability to have a discussion about the ways that your disciplinary framework serves to simplify the problem, and an open mind about that. So,
Success story. So we've touched on it a couple of times. Let's talk about what is often discussed as the clearest example of a wicked problem, and that is climate change, despite the fact that it is still snowing outside in April, but it's Syracuse, so to be expected. So is climate change actually a wicked problem, or is it that it's spawned a number of problems that are truly wicked? If so, why or why not?
well, I'll just point out one thing about climate change, which is, and when I talk about public discourse, I think the public discourse about climate change is really problematic, and in the sense that, there's been, in the sense that most of our discussion is sort of around the science. Is it true? Is it not true? What is, and we can go all into the politics of that and everything. But really I think it is a wicked problem, and I think that by having the discussion about the science, we're avoiding the wickedness. This is a perfect example of avoiding the wicked nature of a problem. And in fact, what's wicked about climate change, and Pete already spoke to this, is that, it involves really hard choices, and whatever we do will have differential impacts on different parts of society, and there's different values at play. So even around a dinner table or in a bar, one can have very legitimate perspectives about what is the role of government in responding to a problem such as climate change that has a cerent amount of built-in uncertainty, and what is the role of global government in responding to such a problem? I think it's perfectly legitimate to be skeptical and concerned about threats to the sovereignty of a particular country or the economic competitiveness of a particular country in relationship to some of the various global forms of organization. I'm not making an opinion about them, but I'm acknowledging the legitimacy of concerns on all sides. And so there's legitimate values. And I don't think we have any real value-based discussion about these sorts of things that I see in the public discourse. It's all about the science. Is it happening? And we're not experts about the science, right? So we're having a discussion about something we're not experts about when we should be having something we are experts about, which is values and being citizens of the country and the planet, and having to negotiate those two things across each other, and that's the wickedness.
I guess I think it really comes down to this question of framing. So when I think about climate change, on one hand, it lacks one of the hallmarks of a wicked problem, which is that there's no known solution. If you define the climate change problem as preventing anthropogenic climate change or driving the rate of change to zero, there is a known solution. The solution is that we have to stop emitting greenhouse gases. Right? So if you define the problem that way, stopping climate change, there is a known stopping point. It's very complicated. It's a very complicated problem, so it's wicked in other dimensions. It's very long time spans, which people are notoriously bad at dealing with. It's very large geographic scope, which raises all kinds of distributional issues. There's enormous amounts of uncertainty. Frankly, from my perspective, it unites two of the least precise disciplines there are, right? Economics and meteorology. So huge amounts of uncertainty. What climate change mostly causes are risks, and there's a huge amount of psychological literature since people are not very good at thinking about risks to begin with. So it's a very complicated problem. If you define the problem as stopping it completely, there is a known solution. But I think what Paul is getting at, and I think really a more constructive way to think about climate is that what we're striving for is not the goal of achieving zero, but achieving a rate we can live with. And that, I think, does have all the hallmarks of wickedness right there. Because what acceptable rate you're willing to tolerate, there is no clear, known answer to that question. And it really depends on your frame. And so I think that's probably the right way to think about climate change, not the zero. And in that sense, it is quite wicked.
I agree that it is absolutely a wicked problem, and that the framing it on a how do we stop it basis is one issue that we're all dealing with on a macro level. And I think if I could flip it and say, let's just talk about storms, frame it as storm severity. And the fact that we've seen a significant change in storm severity, that produces significant challenges for government, state government, local government, and federal government. And you see Katrina, you see Sandy, you see Irene, you see the 100-year storm happening 5 times per year. That causes real problems for someone in my position who now has an entire framework of infrastructure that's dealt to deal with 1-year and 2-year storms, not 100-year storms. And that's where adaptation comes in, and that's being talked about a lot on different levels, but from a municipal level, adaptation is extremely costly. If we're going to see more storms of high severity, we do not have the systems in place to deal with them in a way that's really protective of the environment or people's homes. And that's where in New York City and in that area you're seeing a lot of discussion about not letting people move back to where they were. Looking at Staten Island, where they allowed homes to be built with no barriers whatsoever, and it's a tremendous cost to restore them, and maybe the best answer is to not put them back there and to build some potential barriers for a future storm, which will likely occur. And that the amount of money that's being spent by the federal government in response to Sandy is staggering. And it's unfortunate that that's how we do our business, though, but the event happens, we pay for cleanup. We don't pay for preventative measures in advance, and that's exactly what happened in New Orleans as well. So I think storm severity is a critical reality of climate change that we have to deal with, and we are slowly but surely doing that. And that's where the discussion about is it happening or not is really, I think, behind us, because it's evident that these storms are more severe and they're happening more often.
Right, so with you in Onondaga County, things seem a bit more concrete with regards to environmental issues or climate change. So you spoke a bit about storm preparedness, but what other issues are you facing? How are you approaching them? What are the major issues surrounding how you analyze and approach them?
With regard to climate change?
Specifically, but anywhere you want to go.
Yeah, I think with climate change, I'm fortunate to work for a county executive, Joni Mahoney, who agrees that government has a responsibility to set a tone on the notion of stopping and reducing climate emissions and having a climate action plan. And it's not necessarily going to change the global situation, but I think it makes an important statement that we recognize there's an issue, and we're going to play our role in reducing our carbon footprint however we can. And we're slowly but surely getting there. And I think that it's important for government officials at all levels of government to make that statement and recognize that there is an obligation on the part of government to reduce their carbon footprint when necessary, set goals, measure your ability to get there, and then show that you're achieving them.
Great. So despite the amount of progress that's happening at the local level, there has been total paralysis at the national and the global level. So what are some of the stumbling blocks to progress at a level higher than the city or the county? So
I would say failure to conceptualize an institution, an adequate kind of institution. I mean, I think of like even attempts to do watershed planning often fail. Within the country, because we say, well, we need to solve this problem at the scale of the watershed, and that watershed happens to transcend counties or maybe transcend states, and then that watershed planning structure is perceived as taking away the authority or the decision-making power of the state or the county, and then we don't do it. And it seems to me that there's some way to think about a watershed-based planning structure or a global institution that's around the issue of climate change that can serve the function of helping us think together, plan together, and work together as members of the public that deal with that problem without necessarily taking away what's fundamental in terms of the sovereign decision-making of the units that really comprise our democracy. I think it's an important point is that the shape of democracy is not watersheds and is not the planet. The shape of democracy is counties and states and countries at this point. And we've spent a long time evolving that. And I think that that's really important. And I think that I would personally rather face the threat of climate change in some ways than the threat of sort of throwing away the institutions, the democratic institutions that we've kind of fought and died for. So I find that what we need to do is innovate institutions that allow us to plan and work together at the scale of problems without forfeiting what we have in terms of the democratic structures. I don't have the answer to that, but that's the question I'm asking.
I guess from my perspective, the way that I think about it is that the time where there was any chance that there was going to be a monolithic top-down solution, either at the international or national level, to climate change is long past, and that we're not going to get anything like that. And what we need to do now is to build it up from the bottom. We need, instead of pushing down on really heterogeneous communities solutions that they may not be comfortable with, we're going to have to build up from what people are willing to do at lower levels, right? So what we can look at what counties and states are doing and build on that. And I think there's a lot of prospects to move forward that way, because when so New York and a bunch of other northeastern states have regulated carbon dioxide emissions from power plants through a system known as RGGI. And CO2 emissions in the region have gone down. The sky has not fallen. It's been a model showing that you can move forward without big costs. California, where James is soon going to be working and leading the state ahead, is adopting an even more stringent climate policy. And I think the thing that I think is hopeful about that is that it's a chance for other people to learn that it isn't going to be the end of the world to try to do something about climate. But that's going to have to come up from the bottom, I think, at this point. We're going to have to build on what smaller communities are willing to do rather than push down from the top, a top-down solution. I think the reason is that I think it's the best way we have of, the way that I think about the kinds of things that you talk about, Paul, is that it's really about getting groups of people in a room together where they can have a conversation about their values and about what the consequences of different actions are. And the larger the geographic group is, the harder that is to do. And so I think the progress is going to come from smaller communities building upward.
Absolutely, and I have, unfortunately, a very real-world example of that. Reggie's a great example of a success story, but to Professor Hirsch's comment about the challenges of the democratic structure versus the global problem, in Onondaga County, we attempted to have our legislature adopt a sustainable development plan that had a big focus on recognizing adaptation to climate change and just having a forward-looking, living, sustainable approach to development in our community. And the reaction that we received from our democratic institution, the legislature, was that we were part of a United Nations conspiracy, and that we were in cahoots with the evil forces of Agenda 21, which again is really not evil, and there are no forces. It was at the same time that I think Glenn Beck was trying to get his Agenda 21 book sold, and it was unfortunately it's had a very chilling effect in our community in discussing sustainable development and having a development plan in our community that is forward-looking, because there are elected officials that feel very strongly that there is this globalization effort afoot and that we are part of it, and that because we used software from an organization called ICLEI, that we were buying into this notion that we had to remove people from suburban communities and bring them into the cities and force them to live in communities with no cars, which unfortunately, though, they can take words out of our plan and show that that's what we're saying. But we're not suggesting that we need to forcibly do that. What we're suggesting is that trends show people want to live in denser communities and have walkable access to the resources that they need, and that they don't want to live in cul-de-sac nations anymore. So yes, it's a very real issue to have when you try to initiate something. We saw it with the failure of Kyoto. We've seen success with RGGI, though, where some states did get together, and unfortunately, when it started, Governor Romney was a big proponent of it, signed off on it, and then when he decided his presidential aspirations would be hurt by that, he pulled Massachusetts out of it, and I think they've since returned. So the politics play a very real role in how these things evolve.
One of the key features of Wicked Problems is that each problem is unique, and so there's no single sort of one-size-fits-all solution. And I think that's true both thematically. Something like climate change is a unique problem. It's not like, designing a car. But it's also true on a case-by-case basis. The food, energy, water nexus in Kern County, California is very different from the food, energy nexus here in New York. And so one of the solutions that's been floated as part of the reason that so much progress is being made locally is that it's much easier to bring together the various actors in a single locality on a single issue than it is to bring that kind of level of cooperation globally. So this kind of ground-up approach, is that feasible for something like climate change? You have a lot of cities working on it and a lot of towns and localities, but is it realistic to think that we'll achieve some kind of critical mass using that approach? Is that a realistic way to solve the problem? Or is it a problem we want to solve that way? Kind of a curveball.
So I'll start. I find it very scary, but I also think it's, at the moment, the only game in town, right? I mean, I think it's an open question whether we'll actually be able to make a serious dent in the problem, relying on voluntary efforts that are scattered around and loosely coordinated. But, I mean, as has come up several times, and as I argued earlier, the idea that science has told us that we as a globe need to do something has not prevailed. And so at the moment, I think it's the only way forward.
I mean, I guess I have this sort of faith or hope in, the public sphere, or especially, I mean, actually, you talked about the Onondaga County situation in Agenda 21. I almost see the way I've come to think about it as a sort of preemptive move to that, right? To acknowledge that, you know what, the structures of authority and decision-making as they exist are important and shouldn't be threatened over much. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like my preemptive move. That allows me to then say, and we then should figure out ways to think like a planet, or to figure out how to do some distributive thinking at the scale of the problem, which I think we can all see. There's obviously internet and social media and all these things are tending towards the possibility of some sort of collective distributive thinking at large scales. And if they were liberated from some of these other sort of concerns and actually allowed to flourish, perhaps independently, and here's the risk, your retort could be, well, if there's no teeth behind it, then nothing's going to happen. And good point. I mean, I don't have a very strong answer to that, except for, given what Pete says, I don't see that happening. B, I see some of the resistance to that as value-based and principled. And C, I'm somewhat hopeful that even in spite of that, if you think of a lot of movements in society, they weren't, the movement, the change didn't come from a political or an institutional structure. It came from a social process. And so I think we can have that social process at the scale of the problem.
And I think that'll really be fostered mostly by mayors. And as the mayors combine their efforts collectively through whatever organizations they have, you can see a measurable difference when a lot of mayors get together and agree on a path forward. And Mike Bloomberg's going to spend the rest of his life, I think, attempting to do that. And this is a critical issue that him and his foundation are going to work on. And the way he's doing it is by giving cities resources to put some of these things into practice, to have some measurable impact and to show it. So I think there's definitely hope, and there are definitely players that are doing it. And rather than waiting for Congress to do something, and they won't, the cities are where it's going to be happening.
I now feel like I was way too pessimistic when I listened to what I just said. The other thing that I think is important is that when I think about climate, one of the things that seems to make it a wicked problem is that everyone wants there to be one fix that we can adopt that will solve the problem. I mean, this is instinctive, right? People want to cross it off their to-do list. Even you guys, if you're worried about climate, you'd like to be able to get to a point where you say, we fixed that, and it's done. And the problem with climate is that it comes from fossil fuel use that are so widespread and so deeply embedded in society that we will not have any one big fix. What instead is we need lots of small steps scattered all over through the economy in different areas. And there is progress on that. So the Obama administration is reluctantly but firmly moving forward under the Clean Air Act to start imposing some regulation on electric utilities' emissions of CO2. And it's going to be controversial. It's going to be fought out for years in the courts. But there are going to be some top-down things that will make a difference. Vehicle regulations is another example, right? So the CAFE standards and increase that the Obama administration has put through is going to make a difference over time. So there won't be any one big fix coming down from the top, it seems, but there will be lots of partial top-down things that will help.
So taking a step back, as Professor Hirsch pointed out, wicked problems were proposed as an idea back in 1973, and we've been talking about them for 41 years, and it seems that all the discussion has been, there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution, everything is unique, and that's that. So have we made any progress in identifying how do we approach and solve these, either in the environmental space or others, or are we still sort of where we were, in 1973? That's another curveball.
I mean, I wasn't doing this kind of work in 1973. But I think that the problems that wicked problems cause us to, or the ways of engaging the wicked problems invoke in us, they're sort of perennial problems. I mean, you could say that, of being human and being a citizen and things like that, and being able to think not just from including the bounds of your training, but also being able to willing to think beyond that and being able to really have a meaningful discussion that involves complexity. And, in some ways, I think the public discourse, I imagine it's gotten a little worse in some sense, the public discourse ability to have that, and if we look at media and things like that. On the other hand, there's really positive trends. I think Jon Stewart adds a level of complexity and nuance and to some of the, and that's not the only place, you can find it there. So I think there's lots of different trends, but I guess the main thing I would say is that I think the traction is there right now to engage with some of the fundamental things. People are investing in collaboration and in figuring out how to do collaboration. That's happening right now, and there's big investments, give big grants. If you look at the National Science Foundation, you have to kind of do the wicked problem sorts of things to get a grant. You have to say, this is how I'm working across the boundaries of discipline, and this is how I'm working across the boundaries of research and implementation. And you have to do that in a sophisticated way. And if you don't, you won't get the grant. So, and that's new. So I think that there's a lot of, and there's a conference like this, so I actually think that we're at a point in time where there's the possibility for traction to be gained in this kind of thinking.
Yeah, I just second part of what you said there, Paul. I think outside of public policy areas, the way that people talk about the problem isn't about its wickedness, but the thing that you see everywhere is a discussion of problems being interdisciplinary, right, or multidisciplinary. And that is exactly what these NSF grant competitions focus on everything is supposed to be interdisciplinary. I think that has changed a lot. I was also not doing this in 1973, but over the time that I have been doing this, there's much more serious attention to interdisciplinarity than there was.
I would add that we certainly don't lack for wicked problems. And wherever you all end up in your careers, you will deal, I think, in an interdisciplinary way on wicked problems. And recognizing them like that is a great place to start. So you don't look at the problem in the silo that you may happen to be in. You recognize that there are broader implications to whatever particular issue you're dealing with. So I think the label of the wicked problem starting in 1973 was a good place to brand this phenomena of this multidisciplinary issue that, the Department of Health and Human Services isn't going to singularly solve this crisis, and the Department of Energy isn't going to solve this crisis. I think it's a very healthy way to look at some of the issues that we're challenged with and broaden them to the appropriate stakeholders to try to tackle it and get to that trade-off scenario where you're actually trying to solve them. So, since 1973, a lot of issues have been solved. Lead's been removed from gasoline. Cars are much safer. The Clean Air Act has been tremendously successful. The Clean Water Act has been tremendously successful. So again, not to be too gloomy, government does get a lot of things right. It's just media doesn't opine too often on the good things that it does. But there's certainly plenty of wicked problems remaining to deal with.
With that in mind, a number of people in the room, probably most of us, are theoretically going out in the world to tackle these problems and to attempt to solve them. So what professional advice would you have for soon-to-graduate MPA students?
Me?
We'll start with you, we'll work our way down.
Professional advice is, jump into wherever you end up and listen a lot more than you speak when you start. I think you have to understand the formal and informal channels as quickly as you can. Respect the formal channels and you will accomplish a lot, and utilize the informal channels and you'll be very effective. And that's really how I've managed to survive in a political appointed world. I've never had a civil service position. I've always been in appointed positions. And I've served 3 governors, and I've had a lot of fun working in state government, and I've had a lot of fun working in local government, and I think you have to have a healthy respect for informal channels and formal channels, and show people that you're trying to help them accomplish their goals and their objectives, particularly if you're working for an elected official. They don't necessarily want you to tell them what you think they need to do. They want you to tell them how to accomplish what they've told people they're going to accomplish.
I guess my thoughts on it are, as I mentioned earlier, be open, right? And as Matt mentioned, be open, listen. But also, just to echo something that Armin said and that Paul alluded to, don't get discouraged because the problems that are wicked are the most intellectually challenging, right? I think the word energy, I think Armin said that it was energizing to be working on these problems. And so I've been working on energy and climate related problems for a long time, and progress is slow. But at the same time, it's intellectually fascinating to figure out when you run into a roadblock, whether there's a way around it, or whether you can build a coalition or find somebody whose own goals are consistent with moving things forward. So the way that I'll put it is that wicked problems are worthy challenges for you, right? That you should spend yourself on a worthy challenge. And these wicked problems, those are the worthy challenges. It's hard and it'll be discouraging, but it's worth doing.
I guess I would agree with everything that's been said, and I would add, learn to speak multiple languages is what I would say. Multiple disciplinary languages is one way to think about it. Be able to speak at a fairly functioning level, to economists, and also be able to speak to, somebody who takes a critical sociologist or anthropological point of view. Be able to appreciate the way that multiple perspectives appreciate complexity, because each has their own way, and each is important and offers something and highlights something. So I think if you can speak 2 or 3 languages, at least at a level of sufficiency, if not mastery, that really allows you to engage wickedness in a powerful way.
Could I add? It's a great point, and I would add that whatever issue you're facing, there's probably some historical reference that you can benefit from. And we just did that here locally. We had a speaker come to town who worked for 6 years on the Big Dig in Boston, come to town and try to help us deal with our wicked problem of what to do with I-81. And I think that you will often find some reference where you can go back and say, how did you deal with this problem in your jurisdiction? What's the historical perspective, and what can I learn from the work that's already been done in this area? It's very, very much on the same notion of learning the language.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I want to leave time for questions, but I want to give each of you the chance to give any concluding thoughts you have. What do you want to leave the audience with once they hit the lunch? Anything you want?
I'll wait till question.
Okay. Sam?
I'm happy to open it up, yes.
All right, well, let's just go ahead and open it.
Excuse me.
I want to go ahead and open it up to questions. We've got about 20 minutes, so any questions from the audience? I'll do the mic.
Hi there, my name is Sadie Conrad, and I'm an MPA student. First of all, thank you very much for your time today. I really enjoyed this panel discussion. My question is mostly for you, Matt, working at the county level and state level. You know, we talk a lot about needing discourse and public dialogue, and I think especially because of the way media tends to frame problems, we have a huge lack of that. So I'm just curious if you could give some examples of when you're making decisions, whether it's Onondaga Lake or closing a factory that's taking up too much water. What strategies does the county use to really engage the public? Or are there examples where it's gone very well or where it hasn't gone well at all?
Sometimes the strategy is dictated to you by the process you have to go through. So if you're doing a cleanup process, you have to go through certain comment periods and you have to build certain stakeholder groups. But there's another example where we're now looking at the future of a clean lake and what we're going to do with a lake that, fortunately, one of the benefits of having a polluted water body is that nobody bought up all the land around it and built houses all around it like we see all over the Finger Lakes. We have a lake here in Onondaga County that's going to be open to the public, and it's 95% owned by the public, and we have to go through a stakeholder process now where we're going to invite the community into a discussion and ask them to help us break it into comprehensive units and then determine the future of those units. So that's one strategy that we use that we're stealing from the state of New York that they use called unit management planning, and they do it in the Adirondacks and all state-owned land. So we're volunteering to do that effort and have a community discussion that starts with the notion that it will forever remain in public hands and that we want the public's input on how to use it. As far as the cleanup goes, the cleanup was dictated by a process, whether you're doing the National Environmental Review process or the State Environmental Quality Review process. Sometimes that will dictate how you approach the public and what your requirements are to talk with them. And we don't always get it right. A lot of times there will be litigation and there'll be weaknesses in how you go through that process, and you have to go back and revisit it. But stakeholder management's a critical part of being successful with any policy initiative. Sometimes you go very broad, sometimes you have to keep it narrow. It all really depends on what particular issue you're looking at.
Hi, Ari Epstein. Our own Tina Nabachi and our keynote speaker today, Kurt Kemischen, have proposed a framework for collaborative governance regimes that proposes several drivers of collaboration, initiating leadership, meaningful incentives, and one of the drivers that they cite is uncertainty as a force for creating collaborations. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on the use of uncertainty in getting new partners into a collaboration. And when they talk about uncertainty, it's uncertainty in terms of who will bear the risk and cost of the problem that is being contended with. And addressed to anyone.
I'll make 2 points on that. So uncertainty is a driver of collaboration. So one point, and going back to the point of trade-offs, I've often thought and written that if there's a situation and you're in a position to talk about a decision and you pitch it as a win-win, you say, and in fact the reality is, which is more likely, that there will be gains and losses and winners and losers to some extent. You may be better off acknowledging that in the front, because then what you allow yourself is to maintain your constituency that won't get alienated and disenchanted when there's some losses, right? So I would say, and it's the uncertainty, right? We don't know exactly what all these gains and losses will be, and we still think this is a good decision for X, Y, and Z reasons, but not unless we recognize there will be some losses and trade-offs and things we'll have to learn and grow. So it's uncertainty that's driving that, and I think recognizing the importance of collaboration, the importance of maintaining a broad constituency, to be able to react to it. Why do you need that constituency? To adapt in the face of that unfolding process. So I would agree with that, and that's one mechanism I would see. And the other point I would make is that the whole theory of adaptive management is built around the idea that there's uncertainty. And in order to deal with that uncertainty, we need to do experimental sort of solutions and take steps and have an iterative process. But most important thinkers of adaptive management will say that that's really only meaningful if we have a social learning process that supports adaptation. And social learning is another way to say collaboration, I think. So I would say that that's central to adaptive management. Adaptive management is one way into that, and the idea of maintaining a constituency given uncertain trade-offs would be another.
I'll just add a little bit from an economic perspective on that, I guess, that from an the way that I think about it, there are really two different things that kind of collaboration could achieve. One of them is information sharing. So if the uncertainty is resulting from the from different organizations having different pieces of information, but not everyone doesn't have complete information, then forming some kind of a partnership to share information is clearly a good thing. The other thing, though, that it sounds like that's behind this is risk sharing, right? If the uncertainty is, if it's not really an information thing, it's that you're going to be jumping off in a new policy and you don't know whether it's going to work or not, then collaborating in that sense is just really forming a bigger pool of people who are willing to undertake the risk. And so that would be a good thing, but then, there are going to be forces that work against that too. If it's that kind of uncertainty, there'll be people who want to duck, frankly. So
similar point, but with a political focus, is that exact issue of I think more so at the local level and probably the state level. I think the federal government lends itself more to the broader thinking in the bigger institutions, but at the local level, you'll see a lot of the uncertainty being, will I be politically better off? Will I have more voters if I do this, or will I have angry voters if I do this? And I think fracking is a good example of that. We're seeing the uncertainty. I think the governor's uncertain what the reaction will be if he allows the science to dictate, the engineering to dictate that it is safe. The uncertainty is, well, what happens to my voter base if I say I do it? So the best answer is to do nothing at all. So uncertainty drives a lot of action and inaction.
Any other questions out there?
Hi, Idris, MPA student. You were discussing about the compromise and about how policy might change drastically because of the public pressure. And as we've witnessed the hydraulic fracturing currently in the United States, and I don't know what's the long-term effect of it, and there's this battle between environmentalists and between energy. How do you think how this might change in the future, next 20 years, where the compromise between ecology or energy will even be more elevated, or do you think it's the same going to happen with the case that you presented when they banned it from usage of Hudson River water? Do you think the same might happen to what happened to the hydraulic fracturing thing? Thanks.
So what comes to my mind from your question, Idris, is that we might expect that some of the environmental groups that now oppose it may change their view over time in the same way that a lot of people who were very against nuclear power, environmental groups who almost began existence opposing nuclear power, have now embraced it because they're concerned that climate is a worse problem. And so one possible evolution of the fracking is that people who are very concerned about the risks that it poses now will become more concerned over time about the risks that coal poses if we continue to burn it. And with reasonable regulation, we'll accept fracking. That's one possibility.
I would agree, and I think what we'll see is the industry go above and beyond to prove that the technology they're using, and maybe even invent some new types of treatment technology to show that it beyond a reasonable doubt is absolutely safe and better than the alternative of coal or whatever, or the importation of oil from elsewhere. It will tip the scale at some point. I think clearly we're not there yet.
Yeah, so if in your jobs that you start, next fall, if you're talking to people in the industry, please tell them that so far they have been their own worst enemies, right? I mean, to fail to disclose what's in fracking fluid, that doesn't make people think that it's safe, right? It makes people assume the worst, so there's a lot the industry could do to unwicked its own problem.
Yes.
Do we have other questions?
Van T. Elizabeth. I actually was going to ask about industry's stake in this whole wicked problems, since a lot of it has, I know we are from kind of the public side, but if any of you could speak on your particular discipline or your own practice with kind of industry and how they view these wicked problems, if they view them or if they don't, and how that could actually play into detrimental or success in the future.
So I'll just jump in right off the bat to say that people in industry have a well-defined problem, and it isn't your wicked problem, whatever it is, right? They have fiduciary responsibilities to their stakeholders. So they have a lot of responsibilities. The wicked problem impinges on them, but it isn't their problem. But when you approach them, that is where the resources are, right? That for climate and energy policy, all of the solutions are going to be paid for almost entirely in the end by private sector. So when you deal with them, remember, they need to be brought on side. They need to see that they can help, at least at the margin, in solving the wicked problem, and you need to work with them because, for climate, it's going to cost us trillions of dollars to replace just the U.S. generating stock, some of you have heard, and the federal government's just not going to go out and build new power plants, right? It's going to be the private sector. So all the heavy lifting has to be done there, and they have to be brought on side.
And they're also opportunistic, and they're gonna see. And I think the reason RGGI was launched, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative was launched, was because a number of bankers approached Governor Pataki and said, we think we could be the world marketplace for greenhouse gas trading and marketing. And we want to start with a pilot program with a bunch of states. So it was opportunistic for them to try to create a trading regime where they would make money and also advance a rather remarkable local government experiment where they were there. But with the fracking one too, it's not so much that a company's going to want to help Governor Cuomo make a decision on fracking, but maybe they're working on some new water treatment technology that's going to help make the decision easier for him. Their job is to sell that treatment technology and make money for their shareholders, but isn't that a great outcome though?
Yeah, so I'll ask a question. Just thinking a little bit about public discourse and how do we talk about these really difficult problems. One question behind that is, are we ready to talk about these problems, and can we talk about these problems? And in a lot of communities, my diagnosis would be that there's so much misinformation and distrust and vitriolic language being used that it's very difficult for people to come together and have any type of values-based conversation, or even sort of weighing the risks are so weighed out by other considerations and tensions that people have going on. So dealing with that is very interesting in various places. And I was walking through the Shine Student Center the other day, and I saw that there was an open mic at one of the bars here to talk about fracking. They wanted you to come by and just sort of do an open mic. And so I think we're starting to see this engagement into various communities, and it goes back to this question of thinking across boundaries and acting across boundaries and pulling in other actors and voices. The arts community seems especially ripe and interested in hydrofracking, and I've heard all kinds of other cases, even plays, like community plays, where they're trying to engage these tensions on stage and foster a conversation in that way. So I don't know if anyone would, it's more of a comment. I don't know if you have any reaction. I don't know if you have any sort of reactions to that, or just sort of ideas about what the frontier for engaging into difficult issues could be: climate change, fracking, anything. What's the frontier for engaging into these issues? Yes.
One possibility I see, we think, if we're studying policy analysis, we often think of our job as giving advice to decision makers and giving the best advice, and also helping them think about the problem and expand their view. But it seems like what you've talked about is another opening. So, first of all, you answered a big part of your question, talking about the arts community plays. Those are all really positive openings for having a more nuanced discussion. And art, and the frame of art, is a great way to explore nuance and complexity. From our standpoint of, the social sciences, let's say, I think we could ask ourselves, what can we do to make that conversation more likely or more possible? And I actually think we can do things. So we can provide conceptual tools and frameworks and heuristics, which is a sort of a thinking tool, sets of questions that people can ask themselves. We can almost provide a curriculum for public dialogue, if you will, that could allow these conversations to happen. I don't think we necessarily have the language all the time to have these conversations. Our language is so trained, by media and what we come to, and so it comes out polarized. Even if I think about the form of dialogue, so here at Maxwell we have the debates, sponsored by the Campbell Institute, right? And at ESF we had a discussion the other night about de-extinction, whether or not we should resurrect the woolly mammoth and things like that. And I have to say, I enjoy both debates and open discussion, but I was a little bit dissatisfied with both of those formats because I find they're both missing something. Debate is missing nuance. I take this side, you take that side, and we all know that somewhere in the middle is the truth. And discussion is missing people willing to take a stand. So what I want is like a new model, it could be Maxwell and ESF initiative, where we could have some combination of debate and discussion that allows taking stands and exploring those stands and getting deep into those stands, but also allows nuanced discussion and dialogue and deliberation. So I would like to see us innovate things like that, ways to do that, and then language to use to support that.
I guess what I was thinking follows up on that, what I think is a helpful way forward is to have the discussion be about what people are willing to do, not about what they're willing to believe. I think for climate especially, it's polarized now into do you or don't you believe in climate change, which is about the dumbest possible. That's a really dumb question. And it's pointless. The real conversation should be, what are you willing to do now? Are you willing to take a small step, given what we know, or a big step? And so, the new ESF SU initiative could be about not do you or don't you believe in climate change, or let's discuss climate change, but rather, what should the setting be on the policy between 0 and something else, right? Like, how far can we go today? And then how could we build up to go farther? I can just shout, right? What can we do today, and how can we then build on that to go a little farther in the future, rather than just a yay or nay kind of a discussion.
And I think you also have to continue having the discussions maybe outside of the policy framework with the intention of driving the policy. The direct approach rarely works. I don't think if we called any county executive and said, we'd like to come in and talk with you about climate change, you're going to get much traction. But if County Executive X or Governor X reads enough about the critical issue and there's enough artistic recognition of it and even Hollywood recognition of it and voter recognition of it, it becomes an issue that they have to deal with. So that's what we've been seeing, I think, really, is kind of this conversation that surrounds them that they're not necessarily entirely engaged in. But the president has set a positive tone. I think he made a very important statement when he made Gina McCarthy the EPA administrator, and she is very much a climate activist, and she very much was involved with the creation of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it's a very bold statement for him to make, and I think that was expected of him. So he's driving that discussion as well, but that doesn't necessarily trickle down into the other layers of governance.
Any last questions? All right. In that case then, thanks everybody for coming, and I gather lunch is out in the Commons area.
Lunch, sweet.
So, yeah. Food time. So thanks everybody.